You're listening to the MindPod Network. Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. Head on over to iTunes and leave this podcast a rating and/or a review. It's all happening. 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 It's all Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. Here we all are, episode 127 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That's me. I'm your host. How's everybody doing? This week on the show, Mark Pesce. Mark is a brilliant educator, author, and podcaster, host of the new podcast, The Next Billion Seconds, that takes on the world of crypto finance and demystifies it. By Mark. Truly brilliant. It's on the new Podcast 1 series, so be sure to check that out. We'll get into more of Mark in a second. But for all of you who wrote lots of great letters recently about the last couple podcasts, especially Tommy Chong, I really appreciate it. Follow Tommy on Twitter to see everything that he's doing. I really can't answer those questions. So, last week was also my birthday, my 45th birthday, and this is what happened. October 18th marked my 45th birthday. At this point in life, birthdays don't usually make themselves into huge celebratory events that marvel at how wonderful each rotation around the sun is. They come and go just like anything else. I found that part of the aging process is to look at the actual aging part with a sort of ambivalence, a sort of detached view on the actual number. This way it makes being present in the here and now much easier. I'm neither young nor old, I just am. This birthday didn't do exactly just that. This one saw me hitting a wall that forced me to reflect on what's happened so far. I reckon that 45 means I'm pretty much at the halfway mark. The good news is that I've spent my life around a couple of people who've made the aging process into an elegant dance full of poise and Hollywood good looks, namely Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. My dad didn't even turn on until age 41 and was peaking in his 60s and 70s. He was a model for taking the wisdom of years lived and fusing it with youthful reinvention. Ram Dass, on the other hand, has turned age and physical challenges that could possibly come and wreck anyone else's incarnation into his life's work. He's been in the chair for over 20 years and still inspires, lights up, and shows us all how to be better humans. Truly inspiring. My issue isn't with any of that, or with the example of how to do that. I'm fine getting older. It's the memories of days past that sometimes haunt me and cause me some degrees of restlessness. I seem to have bought a front row seat for the fight of the century, me against me. There I sit, beating myself up all for the things that I have failed at, all the missed opportunities, the failed financial situations, the disappointed employers, and the Saturn wizard of Zach sitting in the middle of my own brain, who's getting tired of piloting a ship that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. If I'm not careful, I can let all those voices keep me under the duvet every morning and tell me that I've failed pure and simple. I've failed. I thought I was going to be a wealthy thought leader at this point with many gold stars tattooed on my Wikipedia page. Hell, I don't even have a Wikipedia page. And then there's the personal Leela. I'm so blessed and amazed that I found the love of my life within the last year, who's arrived at a point when I had pretty much given up on love altogether. She's a brilliant light who is patient, kind, and brings out the best in me. Still, as I sit here and ponder, I fear the process of getting older with no one by my side. that I'll slip into death all alone, broke and with a big asterisk on my tombstone saying, "Darn, he was almost so great." I feel an emptiness in my stomach when I remember all the loved ones who have departed this plane too soon. My dad, my sperm dad, my sponsor Craig, my best friend Richard, and too many others to name. I don't want to be one of them. If I died today, who would come to my memorial? Probably a lot of you, but what would you say? I've been a good friend, but also a shitty friend. My phone rings a lot, but it also goes silent at the throngs of those who I vanished on. Step 6 from the NA It Works How and Why book says self-loathing and humility can't exist at the same time. Certainly, the previous 2 paragraphs reek of that. I can go on and on expressing my pain for what I haven't been able to manifest yet. Or I can constantly toy with my barometer for greatness that hasn't been met. That feels self-indulgent and sad to whine about. For certain, I've done okay, and I'm mostly proud of myself in the 45 years so far. I have some great friendships, an amazing romantic relationship, 2 podcasts that people seem to like. I'm pretty good at chanting mantra, and made a lot of money once, then lost it. Been sexually satisfied beyond measure. Saw The Grateful Dead with Jerry about 100 times. I've sort of made myself into a teacher by default through a form of yoga that's brought me a tremendous amount of contentness, and I can generally sleep well at night. The reason for all the other stuff to come up and make itself heard is to quiet the voice inside of my head that tells me not to go on because it's pointless. By bringing it into the light of exposure, I can then kill it. The light of exposure is where secrets die. It's where shame dies. It's where guilt and loathing, self-loathing, can't find fertile ground to fester. Talking about it out loud makes all of that stuff vanish. This is what 45 has been so far. The best is yet to come, I'm certain of that. And the pain of the past can't be changed. It can only be accepted, embraced, and then let go of, because it's all meant to happen as exactly as it has. That wasn't meant to be a downer at all. Seriously, it just was somewhat of an honest window into my brain as that birthday came and went. So Mark, host of the new podcast, The Next Billion Seconds, which takes Bitcoin, blockchain, and the new world of crypto finance and demystifies it. Mark hosts several podcasts, This Week in Startups Australia, and the one I just mentioned. And Mark is a futurist, inventor, writer, entrepreneur, inventor of VRML, a 3D interface for the web. And he was also a judge on the Australian Broadcasting Company's series, The New Inventors, celebrating Australia's newest inventions. He's written tons and tons of books. My favorite one is called The Playful World, which I highly recommend. So if you are into cryptocurrency at all, and I know a lot of you are, I think this podcast will be very informative and will shed a lot of light. And like I just said, we'll demystify it. Crypto, the whole cryptocurrency world is, just exploded with literally hundreds of cryptocurrencies available to trade on a daily basis. But where do you start? What do you do? So check out this podcast. I hope you enjoy it. I learned a lot from it, really a lot, and I hope you will too. Mark, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's been a while. I know we've met, but it's been a really long time.
We have.
Yes. I think back up at our house, maybe in the early 90s in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I do want to talk specifically about cryptocurrency and cryptonomics, but, when I hear your name and think of you and look back on all of those days, and I think when we were talking about the future in the early 90s, is this how you thought it would look?
Well, yes and no, I think is probably exactly the right way to put it. You know, we should have taken William Gibson a little bit more seriously than maybe we did. I think we looked at the tech and said, oh, that's all cool. And then we took a look at the corporatization of that tech and said, yeah, that won't happen. We won't have to worry about having giant zaibatsus controlling every aspect of life and all of that. And as it turned out, maybe that was the world we got. And maybe they go hand in hand. And I think even Bill Gibson is a bit sort of like, oh, dear, I really didn't mean to get that quite so dead on. So I think in some ways this is the world that we wanted, and in some ways this is the world that we feared, and they're here hand in hand. And it's probably up to us now, with the wisdom of hindsight, to actually take a look backward and go, how could we do things differently in the future? And this is one of the most exciting things that's just happened is Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the web, announced Inrupt, which is a company, but the Solid project. And the Solid project is a whole project that's designed to basically put user data back in the hands of users. So rather than having Facebook or Google hold all of your calendar data, your appointment data, your social contact data, Solid puts that in your hands, and then other companies can actually access limited amounts of it to give you a calendar if that's what they want, or to help you schedule, to help connect you with friends. But they aren't the repositories of that data. They don't control that data. They aren't using that data to profile you. Yeah. And it's really a way of being able to take a look back at what we did wrong because we didn't know any better. And I mean, part of it is we can give ourselves a real big pass around this because this is the first time we've all connected together. It's a good moment for looking back and saying, how could we do it differently now? But the fact that it didn't work out perfectly, it's not the end of the world.
Well, I mean, regarding things like profile, like, the big companies, behemoths like Google and Facebook and whoever else profiling you and using your digital, profile to create algorithms to serve you content and, I guess, on the semi-more nefarious side, to market stuff to you in a more targeted way. Like I'm on the fence about it because in some ways, I've been a marketer for part of my life and career, and, I don't necessarily mind being marketed to in a way that's going to bring me, well, a bunch of stuff I don't need, but stuff that I might think it might look pretty cool. But so what is, but on the other hand, of course, when like projects like Prism and, all the crazy, with the cooperation with the NSA and stuff that Google and Facebook did, that of course scares me, and I can see further down the road how this can be bad. But what is the fear? Walk us through what's the dark side of this?
So I would ask your listeners to go Google The Last Days of Reality. I wrote a big piece about this that was published almost a year ago. And the turning point for me was something that happened here in Australia. May of last year, so May of 2017, a slide deck was being shopped around that was created by the managing directors of Facebook in Australia. And it was being shopped around to the biggest firms in Australia. And it showed them that they had such precise real-time profiling on teenagers that they could know exactly when these teenagers were feeling worthless or depressed or frustrated, and that they could use those moments to target ads at those vulnerable teenagers. And, you worry about Prism and the NSA. I'm sort of like, states are going to do what they're going to do. I mean, yeah, we need to keep a check on them. We need to keep the democracy vital. But when I'm actually looking at how a profile is being weaponized against someone during their moments of vulnerability, that's when I go, okay, this is clearly a step too far. That is not marketing. That's, in a sense, something that's closer to using the underside of what we can profile because of the constant surveillance that Facebook employs.
Yes. I totally am with you there, and there is no coincidence that the rise, let's say, in anti-anxiety medication or antidepressant medications, the exponential growth in them go hand in hand with this kind of marketing. I mean, that's no accident there.
Well, there's a lot to be, I think, there's a lot of anxiety in modern culture, and part of what modern culture wants us to do is to stay anxious, to lack depth. And, this has been, I think, reflected in my own practice. Certainly over the last 5 or 6 months, I've stepped away from social media. It's not that I don't use Twitter. I do still use it. I quit Facebook in 2010 because I could kind of see what was coming.
Yeah.
But I've started to create for myself a private space around myself that I find is that space for me to be reflective and not reactive. And I feel as though I'm talking to a lot of people and they find themselves in a similar position. So it's almost as though this is the next evolution of where we're going to go with these tools. Because we've seen how these tools can get under our skin, what we're essentially doing maybe is thickening our skin a bit.
Thickening our skin. And I mean, and as you said, like you and I you're a little bit older than I am, but we're of a generation that was around before these tools were part of our everyday life.
Yes.
So we have a relationship with these tools and with cyberspace that, you know, has at least the potential for balance because there was life before it. But kids growing up with it today, what are like some guidelines? I mean, I know, you know, we don't want to tell kids exactly how to use media, but what are kind of some guidelines for some responsible ways to use this? Because the ship has sailed, you know, so social media it's part of the vernacular, it's part of the gestalt. So, but I do believe in sort of responsible use and some form of responsible, balanced digital detox, or changing your relationship with it or your view of it. What's your take on it?
So there's a couple of answers here. One is for parents of young children, and the devices are often handed over to the young children, sometimes to keep them occupied, right? And then I totally get how that can be a thing. But we also have to understand that parents have to structure and frame the use of those devices as a type of reward, and as a type of reward that has a consequence similar to candy associated with it. That if you get too much of it, you'll rot yourself. You'll rot your teeth. You'll rot your mind. And so there's a time and a place for it. And a small child will not understand this, but they will follow the example of their parents. And part of the problem is that parents themselves, that's us, are also fanatically bad about how we judge our own time and our own attention and our own use around these devices. Again, we'll give ourselves a pass because 10 years ago, no one had a smartphone, right? It's all brand new here.
Sure.
But now we're starting to see actually we need to be able to think about how we can monitor, become aware of, and limit our own use. And we need to bring that example into our children. You know, teachers are being asked to do this in the classroom. I do a lot of work with educators. But of course, unless that example is coming from home, a teacher is really kind of helpless because they're swimming against the stream. So we've got to see it coming from the home. We can then see it in the classroom. And as kids grow up and mature, what we've seen, what the data is already showing us is they're not using Facebook. Facebook is for their grandparents. Right. They will be on Facebook so the grandparents can check in with them. But what they're doing is they're using more ephemeral media. They're using Instagram. They're using Snap. They're using lots of private messaging channels so they can establish bonds where they don't feel like they're publicly visible because, in fact, that element of social visibility has always been a part of their world. Right. And so it factors into the choices that they're making. So in some ways, although I think it's probably more automatic than we think, they're privacy aware in a way that the rest of us probably need to be. Although, again, for them, it's not thought out so much as it's just the way they see their peers working as well.
Right. Like a teenager, I mean, the last thing that they, like your 16-year-old son and daughter, the last thing that they want in the world is for their parents to be able to see their
yes.
every move in cyberspace, right?
Yeah.
And that's the antithesis of being a teenager.
Right, exactly. A teenager is a process of differentiating yourself from your parents, and social media undercuts that, and where it undercuts that. And again, you know, this is that lovely William Gibson line, the street finds its own use for things, and teenagers are excellent at finding their own use for things. So they are this constant wealth of invention of all these techniques that present them with that thicker skin, at least with respect to their parents.
And in that vein about, you know, finding, you know, it finds its way in the streets and teenagers, you know, and I'm kind of newly a stepfather to a 5-year-old. And, you know, I mean, I was playing around with Apple II Pluses when I was a little kid, but how I see this guy interact with UIs, how it's just innately, it's just there. He can't even read yet, but he can, you know, pinch and zoom and navigate his array around the iPod and through games and exit screens and different levels. And I'm just like, you can't even read. Like, where is this coming from?
It's coming from watching you and his mother. This is the thing, is remember, a small child is a literal sponge, and the objects of their attention are not just the outside world, because they're learning that, but their parents. And so everything they do, and they have seen mom and dad use a smartphone or another screen device from the moment they were kind of aware. It's always been a feature. And so what they're doing is imitating, they're modeling. You see this in families with multiple children, that the younger children will imitate and model the behaviors, screen behaviors of the older children as well. So, I mean, we are wired. Human beings are imitation machines, right? That's one aspect of why we're good at what we do. And so kids just completely soak it up, and it becomes completely second nature to them, because they've never known a world where they weren't watching and learning from someone doing this.
You're right. And I totally get that and believe that, but there's something else about just, I know it's kind of more of a Terence McKennian approach to it, but how, the psychedelic relationship with, what he was talking about, the psychedelic relationship with virtual reality, but kind of extended into user interfaces a little bit, how there is something just about, the general concept of UI that it's, I don't know, is this hardwired in us already somewhere from some, not to get too, Graham Hancock, but from some ancient civilization or not, I don't know, but it continues to blow my mind how kids, and I mean kids, I don't mean millennials like 25 and up, I mean kids can instantly get ahead of the curve and just beat you out. And especially when you're talking about things like you're talking about privacy and new ways to get ahead of the curve and behaving in social media. I mean, I think we could probably learn a lot from teenagers when it comes to privacy and how to behave that way, right? I mean, they could be figuring out new things.
Absolutely. And Dana Boyd is a researcher out of New York, and she has been studying them for 15 years now. And she continuously is learning new things about how they collaborate, how they communicate, how they protect, how they defend, all of these things, because, yes, that ends up being a wellspring in all of this. I mean, I think when you talk about sort of the native capacities of children around these interfaces, whether it's evolutionary or not, it's clearly because what we've learned with user interfaces is what was originally, say, 50 years ago called the man-machine symbiosis. And all of the work that we think of in modern interfaces today really comes out of that work that's 50, 60 years old. I'm going to be doing a short-form series next month about what's called the Fall Joint Computer Conference. This was this event that happened in December of 1968, and it featured what's called the mother of all demos, which was the first demonstration of a hypertext system. So basically the web, although it was an early version of it, was invented and shown and blew the minds of the entire computer science community on the 9th of December 1968. You can Google mother of all demos on YouTube. It'll pop right up and you can watch the whole thing. And when you realize that's 50 years old, that people were trying to talk about what it could mean to bring computers as things that were companions to our minds. And a 5-year-old is now growing up on 50 years of our learning that. 50 years of understanding not just how computers work, but how brains work. And we can't ignore that, in fact, everything we're learning about neuropsychology and neuroplasticity and perceptual psychology is going hand in hand with everything we're learning about user experience. This is one reason why I find Facebook so problematic, because Facebook is taking all of that information and effectively weaponizing it. In other words, using it to tighten the ring of possibilities for an individual, as opposed to Tim Berners-Lee, who's using it to release the possibilities for the individual.
Yeah, and something about, watching, not to get into the cults of personality here, but watching Zuckerberg's sort of evolution personally over the years, there's something, he seems to be somewhat addicted to it.
Well, I think he is a true believer in the rightness of what he's doing.
Sure.
And my feeling, and it's just my feeling, but my feeling is that it blinds him to some of the that he's done. Now, of course, there's that lovely quote, which is that a man won't see things if it's in his best interest to not see them, right? If he's getting paid not to see them. And he's certainly getting paid not to see them. So some of the ways that Facebook has become this monster, I think he maintains a kind of almost Pollyanna-like innocence toward. And when bad things happen, he just goes out and apologizes, even though it's the apparatus that he's created that's produced all of these things. And I agree with you. I think that cult of personality, although the blooms off that rose, Cambridge Analytica took the bloom off that rose.
Sure did. Yeah. Well, talking about the native architectures and ecosystems, and shifting to cryptocurrency now. Now, as far as I could see, and I would love you to educate both myself and our listeners here, but when the architecture of cryptocurrency, since it came pretty much at the, after the novelty wore off of the internet. So there was sort of like, okay, we've seen all of this in hindsight. We've seen the proliferation of the World Wide Web, privacy problems. We see sort of the global cabals of socioeconomic structures being very reliant on giant banking systems. And then so cryptocurrency was created as a way to exploit the most anarchic, open-ended parts of the digital ecosystem that we already have by creating an environment to create a financial ecosystem within that. So it seems to me that from the very beginning, cryptocurrency has alleviated so many of these problems that you just talked about.
Well, it's interesting. So we're now coming up to the 10th anniversary. So on the 31st of October, Halloween, that'll be the 10th anniversary of the original Bitcoin white paper
already?
by... Yes.
Oh my gosh.
We're 10 years into what I call the Satoshi decade. Satoshi Nakamoto, this pseudonymous person. I actually think it's probably a front for a group of people, but we'll leave that alone. This was perhaps the greatest mic drop in the history of the internet. The white paper just goes out there and it sets this off. But if you read the white paper, and the white paper is clear and very readable, really the only thing it really is talking about is not this massive anarchic, bankless, stateless crypto world. It's just talking about something that's basically a better decentralized form of PayPal. Really, that's all it's really aspiring to.
Okay,
and
fair enough.
And yet, when people read that paper, and I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of them on the series, and we'll be speaking to more of them, it set their minds on fire because they could see that although, yes, what it was doing was creating a peer-to-peer electronic cash system for the internet. And the thing we have to understand is it's 2018 and you still don't really have, unless you're using a cryptocurrency, you don't have cash on the internet and you don't have cash on your smartphone. This is a huge point because 4 billion people have smartphones. Now, about 1 billion of those have credit cards, so they kind of don't care that they don't have money on their smartphone. The other 3 billion don't have credit cards and probably aren't going to get credit cards because these are what we call the unbanked or the underbanked. And it's too expensive for banks to provide services to these people because they just don't have a lot of money. And so they tend to fall out of the credit card system, which means they kind of can't use their smartphones to transact. And that's a big problem because everyone's carrying smartphones around and they all want to do business with them. So cryptocurrencies offer a really nice solution to that problem. And in fact, the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has actually introduced a cryptocurrency that's specifically designed to be used for that because it looks like it's a good fit to the problem. But back to the fact that it set a lot of brains afire because it turns out to make this peer-to-peer PayPal, if you want to call it that, you had to invent a couple of things. A blockchain kind of existed before this, but this was sort of a new way of doing it.
Right.
Having this distributed system that's effectively trustless, but you can't really call it that. It's consensus-based, where for me to hand you Bitcoin, the entire network has to come to consensus that I have the Bitcoin to give you and that you can accept the Bitcoin. Right. And that combination plus this artificial scarcity, where there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin in the universe, because that's the way Bitcoin is designed in its basic software. That's how it's designed. And you can't print anymore. There will never be any inflation. These elements came together to give people, I think, an electrifying, almost like a lightning bolt. And the way that the lightning bolt, it flashes very bright, and it allows you to see that there's a huge landscape out there, but it doesn't really give you enough of a view of what that landscape looks like. But all of a sudden, a lot of people just got this view, and then they just headed out. They just went in any direction they wanted to go and take some of this technology, whether it was blockchain, whether it was payments, whether it was digital scarcity, and they started to do their own things with it.
Okay, so explain to me, with sort of the paradigm that you just painted there, how is, but I want to say was, because the price of Bitcoin grew very, very quickly.
Yep.
How did that happen within this paradigm?
So the element of artificial scarcity, digital scarcity.
That's what I want. That's what the term I want to use.
Which was the key thing here, because it was the first time that someone had really produced a good distributed, and digital scarcity kind of needs to be distributed. You can't rely on a central authority to tell you something is rare, because someone can tamper with a central authority. It's hard to trust it.
Right.
And so having this distributed, so where everyone is agreed that this thing is rare, this is the first time that had really been implemented, the first time it really existed in the world. And I think people, in classic fashion for human beings, we kind of mistook the menu for the meal. And everyone said, oh, we have this digital scarcity. This is the scarce thing. And that's when the price of Bitcoin went through the ceiling, without actually other people saying, well, actually, the source code is out there. We can clone it, and we can make Litecoin, and we can make Namecoin, and we can make Dogecoin. And all of these are artificially scarce too, because they're running by the same rules. So people said, well, this is the scarce thing. Well, it's the first instance of the scarce thing, but most people haven't really seen that yet. And it's not that I don't think that Bitcoin should or should not have the value that it has now, but I think the reason it does have that value is because people see it as the scarce thing rather than one version, albeit the first version of this scarce thing.
Right. Well, it's just not at this point. It's just one version of this scarce thing. So
because there's lots of other cryptocurrencies that function by the same rules that are just as scarce.
And how does each one of these? I mean, how many cryptocurrencies are sort of actively traded right now? I don't even know.
Oh God, it's in the thousands. That I know.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah, it's in the thousands. And I mean, that includes a lot of the tokens, the ICOs that have been issued, but a lot of those are actively traded. If you just go to any of the cryptocurrency sites, it's pretty easy to see the top 100. And the top 100 are fairly actively traded. And all of them have slightly different qualities associated to them. Like Monero is quite good because it's designed in such a way to preserve as much anonymity as possible. People do believe that Bitcoin is anonymous. It's not. It's pseudonymous.
Yeah.
Every transaction, if I transacted with you in Bitcoin, there would be entries in this global ledger, this ledger of entries that everyone gets to see, and it would indicate that Bitcoins are moving from one ledger entry to another ledger entry, and it is not impossible. And in fact, there are tools that are commonly used today to be able to trace that out to the people who are doing the trading.
Well, and just not to mention at the very beginning of the first step in that process, when I buy Bitcoin, or when you first set up an account on like CoinMama or Coinbase or Bitstamp or whatever tool you use, the verification process is it's very much not anonymous. 2 forms of ID, photocopies. Why?
And this is called AML, anti-money laundering. So I have done a fair bit of work over the years with banks. And I can tell you that when bankers get together, they don't talk about interest rates or mortgages or even their profits, though they tend to make really good ones. They tend to talk about compliance with anti-money laundering laws, because if they get that wrong, that's when they go to jail. And bankers don't like to go to jail. I mean, it's funny because a bank can play very loose and fast by accounting rules and not go to jail. But if they are caught being criminally negligent with respect to money laundering, they go to jail. And so the national governments now, it was not true at the very beginning of Bitcoin, but the national governments have made it very clear now, particularly with respect to the credit card companies, that if you're buying Bitcoin, let's say through a Visa or a MasterCard transaction,
right,
then there's a chain of custody there, and the authorizing bank and the credit card company has to be assured that you're not a terrorist, or you're not a child smuggler, or you're not trying to move drugs that are illegal over an international border. And they do this by securing all of this identity information. And that then creates the first link in a chain that can be used to trace down most Bitcoin transactions.
And that, and I totally understand all of that. It makes perfect sense, but it does sort of demystify a little bit of like the anonymity aspect of it, that it's some huge anarchic blockchain-based web where you can just pass money around the globe. I mean, not true.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not as utopianly perfect as originally believed, but it's still far better than most other systems. So the nearest competitor is SWIFT, which is what the banks use to move money around. And SWIFT is quite well developed. It's also quite big and bureaucratic because it has to deal with, 160 countries and God knows how many banks.
Right.
And I've done work with SWIFT. They're lovely folks. But when you have a blockchain, which is trustless and very cheap to implement and run and allows participants to basically trade without much of a fee, you can see that some of the ways that the banks have been doing business with each other and with their customers is going to change. Even if they don't adopt Bitcoin, it's going to change because they're going to adopt some of the technologies. And this is what I'm saying about that original white paper. That original white paper gave a blueprint for the financial system in about 1 billion seconds, in about 2050. Most elements of the financial system. And this is the big thing that I think a lot of people kind of overlook. They say, oh yeah, cryptocurrencies are interesting, or Bitcoin is interesting, or blockchain is interesting. Everything touched by money, and this is the main thesis of the CRYPTONOMICS podcast, everything touched by money over the next 1 billion seconds is going to reorient itself around these technologies. They're all going to be touching them in some way.
Well, and then what? All that being the case, and all of those are sort of absolutes that are true, then what's the impetus then for all of these different cryptocurrencies to exist? Like, why is that? I don't want to say why is that necessary, but has that happened only because it can happen, because it could? So it did.
That's a good answer. I think there's part of that. And I think with a few of the first cryptocurrencies, absolutely, because Litecoin was just basically taking the code base, which is up on GitHub for Bitcoin, making a copy of it. In other words, forking that code base, which is the essence of open source, changing a couple of variables so that it has 84 million coins rather than 21. So that's 4 times as many coins. And it settles its blocks 4 times as quickly. So that's every 2.5 minutes rather than every 10 minutes. That's for your listeners, that's an operation where basically the ledger gets balanced every 2.5 minutes. In Bitcoin, it happens every 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. So they just basically changed 2 of the parameters and then put it out there. And when they did that, Litecoin's worth a couple of $1 billion. And that was basically waving a magic wand and creating a couple of $1 billion out of nothing. And I think a couple of people saw that and got, maybe we should give that a whirl. And you have Dogecoin, which was created by an Australian as a joke. And I think it's worth about $200 million now. Right. Okay. So those are the first ones. Those are the clones of Bitcoin. But then when Ethereum came out, and there's a whole other we should talk about some smart contracts a little further in. But Ethereum is this network that's successor to Bitcoin that allows people to create tokens really easily. You don't have to go and clone the Bitcoin code base and run it yourself. You can just create these tokens, and you can create a limited number of tokens. And that's when people started creating what we call tokenomics. These are economic systems where they're using the token.
Wait, Mark, sorry. Explain to us what a token is again. Sorry.
A token is no different than a coin, right? In that it's limited in it's a limited number, digital scarcity, and you can prove its authenticity. You can count how many of them there are there, and you can't spend the same coin twice, right? And those are the three qualities that any money and any cryptocurrency has. But the tokens are created through a different mechanism. And so they're much easier. And the reason you saw all of these initial coin offerings last year was because basically creating your own token offering was as easy as going to a web page and filling out a bunch of data and handing them a little bit of money, and bam, you'd have all of your tokens. So that kind of dropped the floor out in terms of how difficult it was. But when you have a token, why would you spend it? And this is where tokenomics comes in. So one of the companies out of Australia that I'm really interested in is a company called Power Ledger. Now, Power Ledger started off as a company that was using blockchain-based accounting, so this distributed, transparent, inexpensive accounting, so that people could have solar panels on their roof and sell their electricity to their neighbors. Generally, you have to sell your electricity to the electric company, and it's an accounting nightmare, and the electric company doesn't like it because they're really designed to bill you and not the other way around. Sure. But when you use a blockchain, it turns out folks in the neighborhood can trade energy really easily, and it's really cheap to keep the accounting all balanced so that you've bought a little from Joe and a little bit from Sue and a little bit from Sally, and you owe each of them such an amount. And when you pay them in these tokens, so that the token becomes an exchange medium for those payments. And then, eventually you'll settle those payments. You'll convert those tokens into dollars or into yen or whatever. But it's a really convenient way to be able to do the accounting without having to go out and continually do a conversion to dollars.
So when you have a token, how does the wallet work for administrating this token? And explain to us the sort of the centralization or administration of these wallets.
So there's two kinds of wallets, and I think you make a good point here. Some wallets are kept centrally. So I think, is it Coinbase has a big wallet that you can sign up for, and you can put your Bitcoin and your Ethereum and all these other currencies that they've approved in your wallet. And that wallet is stored in the cloud. Now, there are pluses and minuses to this, all right? The plus is that you don't have to worry about losing your wallet. The minus is you have to worry about them losing your wallet. Now, theoretically, they're doing things correctly, and they'll have backups and they'll have security, and no one will be able to hack in and transfer the copy of your wallet to someone else. However, security is a moving target, and attacks get more and more sophisticated. And when you have a company that has potentially billions of dollars in its vaults, that's going to attract a lot of attention, particularly if it's in a form that's digitally transferable and somewhat untraceable. That, to me, seems like the ultimate honeypot for hackers. And so you are gambling with some justification, but you're gambling that when you have an online wallet, the folks who are taking care of that wallet are doing everything in their power to make sure that that wallet is very secure. Now, there's a famous case from the early days of Bitcoin of Mt. Gox.
Of course. I was going to mention that, yeah.
Which is a company in Japan that started off as a trading place for Magic the Gathering, which is what Mt. Gox actually stands for, but went into trading or Bitcoin wallets because it was just a thing to do back then, and then got hacked into, and billions of dollars in Bitcoin got stolen, and Mt. Gox went out of business. And it showed everyone that there was actually real money on the table, and it was probably a good idea to be careful. Now, that's a cloud wallet. You can also have a wallet that will live on your computer or your smartphone. And now I get to tell a little story because a couple of years back, probably 2012, I was gifted a couple of Bitcoin by someone because they were a couple dollars a piece. And someone just mailed me, said, "Here, Mark, here's a couple of Bitcoin. I think you'll find them interesting," which I did. And I put them on a wallet on my phone. And so they were stored on my phone. And 2 years ago, I was robbed and my phone was stolen. And because my phone was stolen and because my Bitcoin were on that phone, the Bitcoin, which later on were worth about $5,000, were also stolen. And the thief couldn't get them because they were password protected, so it was useless to them. But they're just gone now. They're just unrecoverable. And so there's these two sides to the coin. And a lot of people keep an online wallet because they don't necessarily have the technical nous to keep multiple offline backups of the wallet. And that makes a lot of sense. but you are trusting an online wallet to be secure. And so I think that the thing we tell people is caveat emptor.
So yes, and the technological noose, as you put it. So, I mean, I'm of the opinion that cryptocurrency and cryptonomics and, this whole new world here of thinking about finance and money and exchanging should be kind of brought down to the lowest common denominator and really brought to the people. I mean, it still seems to me that it's kind of in the realm of the pretty tech savvy. I mean, it's not your basic 101 sort of thing that you do every day. Getting better, I know. I mean, I'm starting to meet people more. I see this Bitcoin ATM machine at the 7-Eleven, which is pretty wild. But, nonetheless, you know what I'm trying to say here. So what's the next step here in really kind of bringing this to the masses, or do we not want to bring it to the masses? Do we want to kind of keep it?
So my entire goal with cryptonomics is to make all of this completely clear to the layperson.
Yes.
And we start from basics and we work our way up, because I think it's been to some advantage for people to keep it clouded in mystery and to keep it technical. Now, some of that's just because a lot of the first people in the field were very technical and they would just tend to use technical language. But I think after a while, we started to see things that were less reputable, and people were clouding those in highly technical language because it's a good way to throw a veil of smoke up to sort of disguise the truth of the matter. And we saw a lot of people make, I would suggest, poorly guided investment decisions in the first part of this year because they saw what was effectively a gold rush going on in cryptocurrencies, and they put money in and they lost a lot of money. And it's because they probably didn't know what they were trying to do, and they were just investing irrationally. And as we know, investing irrationally is the worst way to do it. It's the best way to kiss your money goodbye. And so what I wanted to do was give people at least the understanding of the basics. And the basics aren't hard. They aren't hard. Give people the basics so that then they can start to make their own decisions and they can make informed decisions, because knowledge is empowerment. And if you're empowered, then when people come to you and say, buy this coin or buy this token or make this investment, you have some guidelines, some ways to think about this that help you think better about it. But you make a really good point here, because a lot of the tools are horrible, and they've been designed by engineers and not by people who are user interface people.
Well, they're complicated.
They're complicated.
Yeah, they're complicated. And you, demystifying this here, and as you say, this is the 101 for everyone, and I love that. I love the premise here and the intention a lot. But how do we? I mean, I see what you're doing here, but at some point, this is where I always, I don't know if it's just a wall in my brain or what, but there's something a wall I keep hitting when trying to understand this stuff, is that sooner or later, I'm going to have to make friends with an institution that is either handling my Bitcoin, administrating it, is my wallet, whatever piece, or my Ethereum, any piece down the part along the puzzle here, along the path. I have to trust some institution. So how is said institution different than trusting Bank of America?
Right. And this is, we live in, if you're working with cryptocurrencies, you're living in a mixed economy. And I think this is the thing we have to see. Okay. The world is not going to go 100% crypto.
Right.
Certainly not in any of the near term. Maybe in 1 billion seconds in 30 years. Maybe. But I kind of don't think so. And for as long as we're living in a mixed economy, there's going to be this mix between trustless and trusted systems. And there's always going to be that moment of uncertainty. But trust, as I'm sure you've already seen, trust is one of the great central organizing principles of the 21st century. Cryptonomics is part of a larger series called The Next Billion Seconds, and we spent the entire second series taking a look at trust from all sorts of angles, because the way we're thinking about trust, conceiving about trust, the way news organizations respond to trust, the way social media responds to it, everything about it. That's all changed a lot recently, and we're starting to reorganize ourselves around what things we think we can trust, what tribes we choose to trust and identify with. Those are very old things inside of us because we're kind of very tribal as people, as human beings. We're kind of very tribal, but they're getting expressed in very new ways. And what you're pointing at here is exactly this, that as you move from yourself and maybe your circle of friends who you do trust, there are other levels of trust that are more indistinct and harder to get a hold of, and you're always taking risk. And you're never going to get to a riskless world. All you're going to be able to do is manage your risks around the kinds of transactions that you're going to do.
It's just all mitigated risk, essentially.
Yeah, well, that's the world. That's the world.
Yeah, that is the world. That's the world. So why doesn't Amazon take Bitcoin?
Oh, I think with Amazon, it's because it's very hard to trade in a very unstable currency. I think at that level, it's, you saw a few businesses pick up Bitcoin and then put it down again because the value is fluctuating. And so what may move them into something is either going to be, and this is the latest episode of Cryptonomics, is into either stable coins or Fed coins. And let me talk about both of those.
Please.
So a stable coin is a cryptocurrency whose value is pegged to another currency, generally like the US dollar.
Right, okay.
Generally it's the US dollar because pretty much everyone takes dollars. And so what they do is that when you buy a coin, a unit of this cryptocurrency, they take your dollar and they put it in a safe. And they say, okay, that dollar guarantees that this coin is actually worth $1 because we can prove it. And proving it, again, this is where you get into this idea, do you trust the auditor who's proving that there's $1 in the safe or not? And that's proving to be a really interesting sticking point around this.
Isn't it?
There's a company out of Australia called Haven that's kind of got around that by backing up their cryptocurrency with another cryptocurrency. You can at least audit that transparently, but you're sort of gambling on the fact that their big store of cryptocurrency is worth what they say it is. Now, you can check, but if there's a big fluctuation in the price of Ethereum, then that could affect that. So there's no perfect solution, but there are ways of doing that. And so then Amazon could take a stable coin and it would know that when it got paid, it was getting paid what it thought it was getting paid. And you were paying what you thought you were paying for it.
Mm.
But then there's this idea of the Fed coin. So if cryptocurrencies are so good, why haven't we seen a US dollar as a cryptocurrency? Why haven't we seen a euro as a cryptocurrency? Why haven't we seen a yuan, a Chinese renminbi, as a cryptocurrency? And the answer there is, well, again, remember what I said about mixed economies, where we have this mix of money and bank issue, I should say, central bank issued money and cryptocurrency. And it's very hard to run a global scale economy, all of those are, on multiple currency systems. That was one reason why they got all the European currencies and instituted the euro, because it was just a mess.
Yeah.
And so these nations are going to have to sort of do a switch. They're going to have to flip from one form of currency to another, and that will take time and a lot of testing. And central bankers, and a lot of people think a lot of very evil things about central bankers. All the central bankers on it basically just care about making sure that they don't crash the currency and tank the economy. Well, they do care about inflation, they care about unemployment, but they care about the stability of the currency more than anything else, because that's the thing they're charged to do. And so they're moving and they're all experimenting, but what I suspect we'll see is a small country, maybe Singapore, maybe Switzerland, switch over to this Fed coin, a state-backed currency. Ecuador tried it back in 2015, but because the rest of the economy didn't come along for the ride, they dropped the experiment 2 years later because they just couldn't get everyone on board. And it's going to take getting everyone in that country on board to get to a state cryptocurrency.
Well, I'm a minority believer amongst my listeners here, but I'm a believer in, the world. Look, the world is getting smaller. We know that. What's now happening across the globe affects us in a much more direct way, whereas 100 years ago, what was happening in the Middle East might as well have been Mars. It's not the case anymore. So I don't have a problem with one global centralized, possibly currency, possibly state-run bank, or possibly like a Fed coin that's regulating, that's kind of taking the Dodd-Frank Act and maybe, applying it to cryptocurrencies here just to keep it stable. Because
I tell you what,
as far as Bitcoin, we got to spend it. It's not just an investment tool. So since you can't really spend it, I mean, you can turn it to fiat and spend it. You know what I mean? You just can't check out on Amazon. I can't go to the Toyota dealer down the street and give them some Bitcoins. It's sort of like, I want that to happen.
I tell you what, I don't think that a global state cryptocurrency is on the coins in the short term, because I can't see the Chinese central bank and the American central bank and the European central bank agreeing that there should be joint coordination of monetary policy. And I think that what we will see is we're going to see several global-ish state currencies that will have their own spheres of influence. And so we'll see something that's American dollar-ish. We'll see something that's Chinese renminbi-ish. We'll see something that's euro-ish. We'll probably see something that's rupee-ish. And these will have zones of influence. And probably at larger institutions, they'll just kind of take the lot. Like the way a large institution will kind of take pretty much any credit card you have, whether it's a JCB card or an Alipay or a Visa or a MasterCard or an American Express. But I think what we'll see is that there's going to be several on offer. We probably won't get to one currency to rule them all. But in the middle years of the 21st century, what we'll see is that the cryptocurrencies that we're using commonly to trade will look a lot like the geopolitical boundaries of the world of the middle 21st century, which is looking a lot like China, Russia, Europe, and the Americas, right? That's kind of the shape of that world. And so you can sort of see that there's going to be at least that constellation of big cryptocurrencies. You can see this now because there's a couple of currencies coming out of China. NEO is the one that I think is the most interesting, which is a smart contract currency. And I want to talk about smart contracts in a moment. And it's created by Chinese, and it's being used in China. Now, let's step back and talk about a smart contract. So we have cryptocurrencies, and they're these stores of value that are transparent and tradable and inspectable, so that you can know how much I have and I can know how much you have if we agree that we're going to let each other know this. But a smart contract takes that up a notch. So it's that store of value plus its computer code. So you and I can now say, okay, Zach, I've asked you to sell me that car. When we have both affirmed that that transaction has taken place, it will automatically be transferred to you. Those funds will automatically be transferred to you. All right. So we've written a contract into the money itself. So I present the money so that you know that I have the money, because you can inspect it. It's like, okay, you've got the money. We've written and agreed to a contract on that money that automatically transfers. So it's kind of an escrow mechanism. And normally you'd need a bank account and a lawyer and all of this stuff. Yep. And that's kind of the simplest version of that. But you can also imagine a smart contract that will pay their kids their allowance when it's also clear that their chores have been done.
Love it. It's fantastic. Create some kind of social accountability to it.
Yeah. But you can also have a smart contract on the money that's sitting in your wallet, so that the money that's sitting in your wallet is also always busy doing the greatest social good while it's sitting in your wallet until the moment you take it out of your wallet to spend it, because that's the way you've written that smart contract. And so we have this idea now that money is smart, and it's going to be busy doing things on its own when you're not looking at it. And this is now, Ethereum is the first sort of smart contract platform, but there's also now NEO, there's also EOS, where I had getting a number of them. There's going to be a lot of different opportunities here. And what I tell kids who are getting ready to go to university, what should they study? I say, look, study computer science and finance, or computer science and law, because the middle of those is smart contracts. And smart contracts will be the way the world works in the middle of the 21st century. Pretty much everything that we're doing that's business related will be using a smart contract. Most of them will be simple. Some of them will be fun and very complicated. And let me tell you, that's going to keep, everyone thinks lawyers are going away. No, that's going to keep a whole generation of lawyers very comfortably employed.
Now, I don't know if you're giving investment advice here, but kind of turning to that for a second with everything that you just set up here with smart contracts and very eloquently just setting up the map here. As far as investments go, I'm not saying like what Bitcoin we should invest in or not, but wise thing to do, aggressive thing to do. Where does one start? What would you kind of tell? Not quite the layman, but the middle layman, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Buffett rule. Yeah. Right? Buffett rule. If I don't understand it, I won't invest in it.
Yes. Understand it first.
Right. Understand it first.
Yeah.
With almost all coins or tokens, there's a white paper. And you can read the white paper. And in fact, the next episode of Cryptonomics, I kind of take apart the marketing behind a white paper, because a white paper generally tends to play on your heartstrings. It generally tends to tell you why this coin is going to be a good thing for the world.
Of course.
And, it might be, but you kind of need to kick the tires. You need to look at the team. You need to look at their track record. You need to see how far they've come. And I think these are the questions that a normal share investor would be asking. They're not stupid or weird questions. So you want to minimize your risk by doing as much due diligence on your investment as possible. You don't want to just take a hot tip. And plenty of people have done that. And I'm not saying hot tips are always bad, because goodness knows sometimes they work out really well. But if you're investing for the long haul, then you really want to be doing your homework, or going and contracting the services of someone that you trust who's doing their homework.
Ah, yes. Got it. Well, your podcast, Cryptonomics, it's online now, as well as the amazing books. You've The Playful World, How Technology Transforms Our Imagination is my favorite of yours. Going back, when did that come out? 90s?
2000.
2000. Okay, yeah, it's my favorite of yours, and the podcast is fantastic. Mark, this I'm stopping the podcast here because this is a lot to take in. And it's been an hour, and it's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach.